Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LCS Week 7 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. Just like with all the other regions that we've covered this week, we're really wrapping up the regular season now. We are getting closer and closer to playoff time, and I'm excited for it. I hope you guys are as well. Of course, every single game becoming more and more important means that pretty much all 10 of these games have some impact on the playoff standings, so I'm excited to go over them, and I hope you guys are as well. Of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of the LCS this week. Who overperformed, who underperformed your expectations? What teams are you actually looking out for? Maybe some sleeper teams come playoff time. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback. Of course, if you didn't watch the games, let me know what you think of the video in the comment section below. It really does help me with an idea of where to go with a lot of these recaps. But let's not waste too much time. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into day number 1. It's a regular week here in the LCS, right before the Super Week, final week of the season. So 10 games across 2 days to cover here. Let's kick it off with the first one, and we kicked it off with a pretty traditional start, especially considering the last few weeks. We had FlyQuest taking on Team Liquid, and it's an upset, a pretty big upset to kick off the week as Team Liquid ends up taking the game here in 26 minutes. Really impressive stuff coming out from TL. Really happy to see them be able to pick up the win. First of all, got to point out, I think FlyQuest has opened up the LCS like 3 weeks in a row. I guess that's just what they do. They want to put their best games at the beginning of the day, as they've said, and FlyQuest typically is their best game. But let's go ahead and talk about whether or not this was their best game. Spoiler alert, it was not for FlyQuest. It was for Team Liquid, though. This might be one of the better performances, if not the single best performance that this team has shown across 2023 so far. A really good look from a team that honestly has gotten a lot better in recent weeks. Yes, the consistency has still been a little bit of a problem with them. You can talk about how, losing to TSM last week was certainly not a loss that they wanted to take, but remember, right before that, they beat Golden Guardians, and the week before that, they were looking really good as well. Pyosik, in particular, has been a ton better over the second half of the split. He's going to get my player of the game here on the Lee Sin. He really opened up this map. He was easily the choice for player of the game, easily the best player on this team in this one, and that's really been the case for Team Liquid's sudden resurgence, I would say, over the second half of the split. Yes, you can talk about how, Yon and Core are still playing well, and Summit has really limited a lot of those, like, what are you doing plays that he had at the beginning of the year, but without Pyosik being able to win in these early jungle matchups, I do think that Team Liquid would still be having a hard time winning series. We saw that against TSM last week, and so for Pyosik to step up, especially against a team like FlyQuest, a player like Spica, who's maybe been the best jungler in the entire league up until this point this year, it's a really good sign. And honestly, if he continues to play like this as they head into playoffs, Team Liquid might actually be a team that can surprise, supposing they actually do make the top 6, because Pyosik's looking really good, but, Team Liquid have dug themselves a little bit of a hole. Obviously, he wasn't the only player on the team. I think Core JJ was phenomenal in this one. I haven't really talked about Core a lot over this split, but he's still been really solid. Maybe not the best support in the entire league, like we've kind of gotten used to with Core JJ, but he still was really good in this game. The Thresh, I think, is really difficult to play into if you're playing from behind, and that's kind of the situation that FlyQuest found themselves in, especially a good Thresh like Core JJ that's going to be able to affect the map, that's going to be able to take over the game. It's just really difficult to have to deal with that, and then, of course, Yon was following up really well on the Aphelios. Those two, I think, have been a really underratedly good bot lane duo over the course of the entire year, and I think they showed that off again in this game. Harry, Summit, everybody was good on the side of Team Liquid. Everybody pulled their weight. This is a scary Team Liquid team. It's scary in the sense that they can kind of win from multiple avenues. Obviously, bot lane's kind of been a point of pressure for them at the beginning of the year, but what we're seeing as we go further and further along into the split is that players like Pyosik, players like Summit, are going to eventually come into their own. Obviously, we're still waiting on the big pop-off moments from the top laner here, but the jungler is, for the most part, there at this point. I would say Pyosik, over the past 2 weeks, has been one of the more interesting junglers in the entire league. Now, obviously, he can be a little bit streaky. To expect this to last the entire rest of the split probably isn't, realistic, but I would say that the talent level has shown to have not disappeared completely, and he seems to be getting closer to locked in mentally than he was at the beginning of the year, and that's really the important step for Team Liquid to take. I think if they can get over some of their demons, maybe some of their underperformances on the top side, this still very much can be a dangerous team heading into playoff time. And then there's FlyQuest on the other side. I mean, this is the third loss that they've suffered, the second in 2 weeks here. Not exactly what you wanted to see. This team was cruising undefeated for most of the first half of the split, And now they're kind of, starting to come back down to earth a bit. I think they're starting to get a little bit closer to maybe the rest of the pack. That's not to say that I'm completely out on this team, but they're allowed to have bad games every once in a while, and unfortunately, this was one of them. My dud of the game is going to go to the king himself, Prince, in the bot lane. He's been awesome up until this point this year, obviously, the leading favorite for MVP in the LCS right now, but this was probably his worst game of the split. Pulling out the Lucian Nami, it's just not a pick that I think is particularly strong right now, as we're seeing from global results, but especially in a league like the LCS that tends to have games, generally speaking, go a little bit later. Teams don't punish the early game nearly as much in the LCS as they do in a lot of other regions, and so I really don't think Lucian Nami's the pick here. I'm not going to blame it entirely on draft, but I definitely don't think that was the way to go in this game, and Prince definitely showed that off. Not being able to generate an early lead, quite frankly, getting outplayed by Core JJ in the early game, and then once you get to that mid game and Aphelios has gold and Lee Sin has gold and Ahri has gold, and you don't, it's very difficult for that champion to actually have any relevancy. Ayla is somebody that I want to mention. I'm not completely out on him. I know I was really, really in on Ayla, obviously, last year. And when he came back here to the LCS, I was a big proponent of him staying in and playing rather than Winsome, because I do think that the upside that he brings to this team is just simply higher with him in it than without him in it. And I still agree that that's the case, but he's definitely not got the synergy that Winsome had with Prince or with the rest of this team. It seems the disconnect is a little bit there still. I expect them to be able to get over that, but right now it's just a little bit of a question mark. Impact was solid on the top side, but Vikla really struggled in the mid lane matchup. Spica got out jungled by Pioshik. FlyQuest just had a bad game. They looked outmatched in this one. That's going to happen every once in a while. It's best of ones. You have to remember that. It's like if we criticize T1 for losing a game one against a team like KDF, which they did earlier this year. Yes, that is going to happen every once in a while, even to some good teams. It's all just about how you can bounce back from maybe a poor showing. And I expect FlyQuest to bounce back pretty well. It's just a little bit of an awkward way to start your week 7. And then for Team Liquid, it's the exact opposite. Great way to start your week. They looked really good in this series. If Pioshik, if Core, if Summit, if Yon, if Harry can keep this up and continue playing at a high level, this is a team that definitely can still make the playoffs. Remember, they're not eliminated just yet, and so definitely some interesting things moving into the final couple weeks. Team Liquid has to be on everybody's radar now. And then moving on to our second game of day number 1, it's kind of an interesting one. Again, as we get closer and closer to playoffs, all of these teams that are really right around that barrier make for interesting games. And we got another one here. We had TSM taking on Immortals, and TSM does pick up the victory here, and it's off the back of their new addition in Wild Turtle, their old new addition in Wild Turtle in the bot lane. Sometimes bringing a familiar face back can yield fantastic results, and TSM is learning that in spades right now. Wild Turtle's going to get player of the game for this one, and it wasn't particularly close. A really fun, close game, especially towards the back half. Immortals was certainly not run over in this, which I will get to. They've been really competitive ever since Balulu came in to play mid lane, and he played awesome in this game on a Vel'Koz that we're just not seeing anywhere else in the world. His eclectic champion pool has definitely followed him here to the LCS, but let's go ahead and talk about TSM first and foremost. Wild Turtle coming in and being as good as he has been a little bit of a surprise to me, because if you don't know, I covered the NACL on this channel as well, and I've been covering TSM challengers all year long so far, and Wild Turtle's just kind of been good there. I certainly wouldn't say he's been bad. That's a team that has really struggled with consistency, especially coming out of the jungle mid spots, but Wild Turtle was just kind of meh on a team that felt like the worst challengers team for quite a while during the regular season, but he gets called up. Neo is underperforming, and honestly, Wild Turtle looks fantastic on this new roster. Side note, Neo looks better than he has all year long on TSM challengers, so it was surely a good move for both players as both are playing at a high level, but you put him on the Caitlyn, you let those headshots start rolling in, he's going to be critting you for like your entire health bar, especially if you're a squishy. And there's just really not a lot that you can do about it. His early laning phase is so aggressive, especially with Chime, who I think really helps him out a lot. I really like this bot lane duo in terms of playstyle. Both of them really do want to make plays early, and I think that helps out TSM quite a bit. That was a problem I had with them early in the years. It felt like they were giving over advantages at the beginning part of the game. Maple's a little bit slower. Boogie's a little bit slower in terms of how they like to play the game. Solo's a little bit slower. I think adding Wild Turtle and Chime, a pretty aggressive bot lane, is really helpful for this team. You can pick the Caitlyn Karma, and you can go to work. You can generate those leads, you can get to the mid-game skirmishes, and you can have an ADC that is ready to pop off for a ton of damage, and that's what Turtle did. Obviously, the steal, the 1500 headshot crit steal, I mean, was it even ever in doubt, right? It's Wild Turtle. He's back in the LCS. He's going to do it, but he's just been so fun. So fun to watch. Really, really proud of him. Chime also was great, like I said, but you got to give a ton of shout out to the rest of this team as well. Yes, this kind of was the Wild Turtle and Chime show, and they definitely, in my opinion, were the two best players on TSM, but Maple's been really good this year. A little bit of a step back in the second half of the split. He was on MVP pace for like the first couple weeks of the season, but he's just become a really solid mid laner, which is still more than I think what he gave this team last year. Boogie's been solid, maybe not the best jungler in the entire league, but solid, and Solo's been a rock in the top lane, and he was definitely the better top laner in this game, and so credit to this TSM team. They found a bit of a formula, and it's really starting to work out for them. As for Immortals on the other side, it's a good effort. Like, I hate to say it, like, I know losing isn't exactly ever going to be a positive for a team, especially in the LCS, but Immortals definitely, held their own in this series. Balulu in particular is a massive upgrade here in the mid lane. I like Blaze Olive as much as the next guy, but Balulu just gives you that extra spark. His champion pool's weird, and he really knows how to take advantage of some mid-game mistakes. He is really adept at being able to generate gold leads for himself, basically no matter who he is going into. And so big ups to Balulu. I thought he played well. I actually thought Kenvi played pretty well in the jungle on this Viego as well. If he had a tad bit more pressure, Immortals probably wins this game, but I'm certainly not putting the loss on him. Unfortunately, my dud of the game is going to go to Revenge in the top lane. I like Revenge. Honestly, this split has proven to me that Revenge is one of those guys where if you put him on a better team, he's probably going to look like an upper tier LCS top laner, right? He has the mechanics. He just doesn't necessarily have the backing and the track record to be able to prove that maybe he's in the upper echelon, but he's a more than capable LCS caliber top. Unfortunately, that didn't necessarily show itself in the decision-making in this game. That teleport in particular, bot lane, was really bad and ended up giving TSM a ton of pressure and a ton of prio and really making the game a lot harder, but even some of the engages in the back half of this game coming out from the Nard just weren't perfect, right? You need to be a little bit more collected, especially when your team is playing from behind, and I think with Kenvi and Balulu being able to reset, especially if a lot of these fights end up going long, Revenge probably could have slowed down the game a tad bit more and it would have been better, but it's just not the situation we lived in. I'll also say that Tactical wasn't particularly good in this game. Tactical and Fleshy were just kind of meh. Wild Turtle was definitely the better AD carry across both of these teams, which is funny because they swapped teams from last year. Wild Turtle, obviously, the starting ADC for Immortals last year. Tactical, the starting ADC for TSM last year, and so to see them go up against each other and have Wild Turtle come out victorious is just a little bit funny in terms of how it ends up working out, but Tactical's gonna have these games. Sometimes you play Poke Varus and he does 0 damage. That's just how it's going to be every once in a while, because you're going into Scion, you're going into Karma, Mantra E, and it's just like, how do we break through? The Nautilus really couldn't get on anybody. Their big damage was in the backline, and you don't really have a great flanker on this team. That's what Revenge probably wanted to be, but again, fights just went a little bit too quick, and Caitlyn ended up being a little bit of a problem to try and break through. So unfortunately for Immortals, they lose this one, but at the very least, this team is interesting. They are certainly more interesting to watch now than they were last year. I don't even think it's remotely close, and I think that, generally speaking, has to be a positive, but there are upsides to this team, maybe just not in terms of, immediate standings potential. And then for TSM, they're very much in the playoff race. So sitting at 7-7, right around number 6 in the standings. I think they are actually at number 6 in the standings. This is a team that, if they made playoffs, they'd have to be incredibly excited. Not only did you replace your AD carry mid-split, but your preseason projections were just not good, basically from anyone, me included. I put them at number 9 in my preseason predictions. They have definitely outplayed that. Maple is good, Wild Turtle's good, Chime is really good, Boogie and Solo can certainly have good games. TSM is not a team to be taken lightly, and I certainly think that the standings, especially with Team Liquid's win earlier in the day, are going to be incredibly interesting down the stretch here in the LCS. And then moving on to our third game of day number 1 here, and this is a clash I was really looking forward to. All the games have meaning this week, but this one was one I was especially interested in. We had Evil Geniuses taking on Cloud9, and C9 picks up a strong win. Kind of saw this one coming. I've been in and out of the EG train, I would say, over the course of the year, but I'm leaning towards more out right now than I was definitely at the beginning of the year, but even throughout most of the beginning part of the split, when EG was able to take that game off of Cloud9 earlier in the year, and even after they beat FlyQuest last week, I'm still very hesitant on this team. They're just so inconsistent. Now, there is a caveat with this game, and it is worth noting, Jojo Pune is very sick. That was super noticeable on stage, even just on the cameras, and we came to learn that later in the week as well, as this would be the only game that he would play this week for Evil Geniuses. But it is worth noting that maybe they're not full strength EG right now. They still weren't able to get this done. On the Cloud9 side, though, this team just looks really good when they play the style of League that they like. I was concerned with the fit of Blabber and Eminus, at least early on in their careers, but they have already proven to me, basically beyond a shadow of a doubt, that that fit is going to be just fine. Now, it's not perfect, right? I think Berserker has taken a bit of a step back in terms of resources in order to make sure that Eminus feels a lot more comfortable in that mid lane, but Berserker's going to be fine. He can play a low resource 2v2 style in the bot lane on something like a Lucian Nami that's going to be relevant. It's going to be able to generate its own leads. He doesn't need jungle attention all the time. Now, are you going to want to give a player like Berserker jungle attention every once in a while? Absolutely. Are you going to want to give a player like Fudge jungle attention every once in a while? Absolutely. But, you know, there are absolutely games where you can put them on more, you know, passive picks, things that you can kind of isolate in the lanes a little bit more and then focus on that mid lane position that loves to get the resources in Eminus, and that was absolutely the case here. He's going to get player of the game. That's already his second. He's only been playing a couple of games, so big debut already for Eminus. He's been really good for this Cloud9 team. He pulls out the Tryndamere here. I've been really high on this Tryndamere pick over the course of the year, mostly because people really only pull it out in situations where it actually can win, and I think this was a situation where they don't really have a lot of tools to deal with it. I mean, in the late game, really, your best way of winning if you're Evil Geniuses is trying to play through the Aphelios, but Aphelios can't really play at all into Tryndamere, especially if he gets ahead early. And Eminus was just much better than Jojo Pyun in this game. Obviously, Jojo has his ups and downs, but this was mostly a down, I would say, overall across the game. Eminus definitely taking advantage of that. But I would say Blabber is still honestly underrated as a jungler. I don't know how we continuously get here every single year, but it feels like everybody's on the same page with Blabber at the beginning of the year where they're like, he's great, he's maybe the best LCS jungler of all time, he's one of the best junglers in the league, and then as the season goes on, and yet he continues to play well, people seem to kind of fall off the narrative with him. I think that there are always some flashy picks to jump ahead of him. Inspired's definitely on everybody's mouth right now. Spica's had a great series, or great split, I should say, in 2023. There have been a lot of junglers that I think have made a really good impact towards their teams, and rightfully are getting credit for it, but let's not exclude Blabber from that conversation. He still has been fantastic for Cloud9, and he was great again in this game. Gragas is one of the picks that I most associate with Blabber. I think a lot of people would consider it his best champion, or at the very least right up there with the Olaf, and so it's always good to see him pull it out, and he did a really good job facilitating for his mid laner in this game. Berserker and Sven won the 2v2 in the bot lane. Fudge was like 0-0-0 at 29 minutes, as was Someday. That's just what top lane is right now. Cloud9, just generally speaking, looking good. Not really a lot of complaints to come from me. And then for Evil Geniuses on the other side, again, kind of hard to understand where exactly this team stands right now because their mid laner and one of the most important players to their team was incredibly sick. So noticeably sick that he was benched for the day after, and that's okay. Hope he gets better, but he was really bad in this game. He's going to get done of the game. He's gotten a lot of these this split. I know I'm high on Jojo Pyun. I still think he can be the savior of NA, you know, the best mid laner in the region, NA's biggest endemic prospect, you know, all the things that have been said about him. However, the consistency is bothersome. I'm not going to harp on it too much in this game because, again, you just don't really know what he's going through, but it's another example of Jojo playing a melee carry into a matchup that isn't particularly good for him and just kind of getting beat at it, you know, not necessarily winning in the 1v1, getting out macroed, and then really not having any sort of pressure in the mid to late game. It's certainly not the first time this year that this has happened to Jojo, and something tells me that it will not be the last either. I think other negatives to point out, I thought Inspired didn't really do nearly enough in the early game on this Elise. People have been really in on Inspired in 2023. I'm halting the brakes a bit on Inspired. I think he's been solid for this Evil Geniuses team, one of the better junglers in the league, but he's in the MVP conversation right now in terms of how a lot of people start to view him. I just don't see him in that same light. I think that there have been a lot of games that have been attributed to him that I haven't necessarily said like, oh, this is just a jungle gap on the side of Evil Geniuses. I think this team mostly works as a cohesive unit, and while Inspired has been pretty solid, like very good for this team, I don't necessarily think he's been dominant. I think this game was a good example of that. It felt like he wasn't able to generate the same kind of pressure that he needed to in the early game on the Elise, and then by the time we got to the mid game where both teams were relatively even, C9 was actually in a position to be able to pull ahead due to the macro, and so, you know, pluses to C9, minuses to EG when it comes to that, but generally speaking, I still like this Evil Geniuses team. They're solid. I do wish that, and this is kind of funny to say, I wish that Evil Geniuses played with the same kind of intensity in all of their games as they do in the ones where Vulcan finds someone to beef with on Twitter. It seems like they win every single game where Vulcan's got some level of beef where he's talked some shit on Twitter and then somebody wanted to clap back at him, and then they go into the game. It feels like Vulcan does such a good job at being able to win those games, and then Evil Geniuses go into all these other games where it's just kind of a regular game and they play so much different. Obviously, I'm not saying that that's entirely the circumstance for why things happen the way they are, but it definitely feels like EG is more locked in for some games than others. I guess I just wish that it was a little bit more consistent with which games they were on for and which games they were off for. Obviously, I'm not going to entirely predicate my opinion of this team on this game, but I didn't expect them to be able to win it over Cloud9, even considering their recent form, and they honestly delivered exactly what I expected in this game. And then for Cloud9 on the other side, this team is really good. I mean, there is a real chance they are the best team in the LCS, especially with FlyQuest kind of struggling the way that they are right now. Eminus has integrated himself into this team pretty flawlessly. Berserker and Fudge are still some of the most talented players in the entire league. Blabber is a beast of a jungler, and Sven kind of ties it all together. This team really is incredibly dangerous, and I feel like they've almost gotten lost in the shuffle because of how things have been going for FlyQuest and Evil Geniuses and even a team like Golden Guardians, you know, kind of stealing the spotlight. Cloud9 is still one of the most talented teams in the league, and they're definitely going to be poised for making a run to the finals this split. And then moving on to our fourth game of day number 1 here. It is a really good game. Maybe not so much in terms of gameplay, but in terms of, like, interestingness. This is just about as interesting as it can get. We had Golden Guardians taking on 100 Thieves. And 100 Thieves pick up the win here. I can't believe that I'm saying that 100 Thieves beating Golden Guardians is an upset, but that's kind of where we're at this point. Golden Guardians obviously kind of faltering a bit in the recent weeks after going on an absolute tear in the middle of the split. They started off 0-4. They end up 8-5. That's still pretty freaking good in terms of results, but they run into 100 Thieves in this game, and they just aren't able to overcome them. 100T definitely coming out to play. They've got a new head coach, Nuke Duck, officially taking the role of head coach on this roster, and as we all know, just win. Just win. Come on, Nuke Duck. Nuke Duck, just win. And they just won. Really, really good stuff coming out from 100 Thieves. Really impressive, and there's one player in particular that I have to give a ton of credit to, and it's the jungler, it's Closer. I've been super critical of Closer over the course of the year so far, going as far to say, you know, maybe minus like Santorin and Kenvi, he's been the worst jungler in the league. I think he's been worse than Pioshik. I think he's been worse than, Boogie, insert other jungler that people aren't excited about right now. I think he's been right down there with the bottom in terms of his performance so far in 2023, but this was the performance we really needed to see. Him on his classic Lee Sin, his best pick. You know, obviously that the Jarvan come to mind as well, but the Lee Sin is Closer. You get him on Comfort. You get Bjergsen on Comfort. He gets to play Azir. You get Double Lift on Comfort. He gets to play Xayah. You get Busio on Comfort. He gets to play Rakan. Everybody on 100 Thieves kind of just getting back to basics on this one, and they went and performed. A great early game coming out from Closer, which is just not something we've really said all that much about 100 Thieves. In fact, it's been their biggest kryptonite, is that even when they decide they want to play for early game, they usually don't execute on early game very well. They are a team that is pretty solid when it comes to the late team fighting portions of the games. They're very mechanically talented, but they just don't really seem to have an idea of what to do early on in games. So for them to come out and really dominate the early portion against what I would consider to be a pretty good early game team in Golden Guardians is just a really good sign, I would say, overall. Closer, easily player of the game in this one, and probably the player that I was most impressed with over the course of this. Of course, everybody playing well. Bjergsen was awesome in this game. I know that there's a lot of hate out there for Bjergsen. There always is going to be for players who are as popular as he is. It's going to be very rare that you find a player as popular as Bjergsen who doesn't have haters. It's just kind of generally, it comes with the territory, right? But I don't think a lot of them are going to be saying that he was awful in this game. Maybe he wasn't the focal point. That was Closer, but he outplayed Gory by a considerable margin, someone who has really become the darling of Reddit over the past few weeks. You know, rightfully so. I'm not trying to take away from Gory. He's really good, but Bjergsen was really, really solid in this game. On Azir, it feels like he's got some newfound confidence in him. Of course, his jungler winning probably gives him a lot more freedom to be able to try and make plays in the mid game. That's always going to be the case when it comes to a mid laner, but it's just good to see Bjergsen being able to take advantage of that. I would say Closer, Bjerg were definitely the two members that kind of stood out as the most influential across 100 Thieves in this series. I thought Busio was really good in the support position. Definitely some really good Rakan engages. I like him on this champion a lot. Probably his best champion, at least at the LCS level. Double Lift has pulled out the Xayah a ton this year. It's an incredibly safe pick. You don't have to give a lot to it in the early game for it to be useful, but it can win lane, especially if isolated in the 2v2, which it did kind of in this game. And then Tenacity in the top lane was really solid on the Gragas. Going into Licorice, that should be a matchup that 100 Thieves should be able to win, and they pulled away with it. Overall, I'm just really impressed with how this team played this game. Very, very happy to see Jungle Mid actually winning early for 100 Thieves, and I just gotta hope that they're able to keep this up, because this is a team that absolutely has no business being 5-8 with, 2 weeks left of the season, and so for them to come out and pick up a really big win against an actually good team like Golden Guardians, it's a good sign that they are at least moving in a positive direction. As for the aforementioned Golden Guardians on the other side, I'm getting worried a bit about this team. And again, I know it's a little bit too early to be getting worried, right? They've only had one loss in like the last 4 weeks. But I've always been a little bit hesitant to consider them among the best teams in the LCS. I felt good about putting them at number 2 a little while ago because Cloud9 was kind of struggling. Evil Geniuses was definitely struggling, but Golden Guardians kind of felt like they were on a hot streak and they were proving me wrong. But the cracks in the armor started to show last week, and I think they've only come out more in full force this week. My dud of the game is going to go to Gory in the mid lane. This, to me, is a little bit more preventable. I think of all the players on the team that I would expect to see kind of bounce back, it's probably going to be this mid laner, probably jungle as well, but mid lane, especially, Gory's just way too talented. He had a bad game on a Yone pick. It's going to happen every once in a while. I'm not going to expect him to be perfect, but I do think it kind of highlights the underlying issue is the word I'm looking for, the underlying issue with Golden Guardians, and I hate to say this because this makes it sound really bad, but I really am worried that if Gory has a bad game, that Golden Guardians can't win. Like, if he underperforms in any game, that they don't really have a backup plan. I know 6A and Licorice have gone on, podcasts talking about how they didn't really change much from last season or 2 years ago to this one. They kind of just got better teammates. And I'm like, great, that's good. It's good to know that, like, this performance is always in you, but it does worry me a bit that the only difference between you winning and losing is how good your teammates are. That leads me to believe that maybe if Gory and River stop performing at a super high level like they have been this year, maybe they don't have enough firepower to be able to keep it up. Again, I still think Golden Guardians is a solid team. I think who he's shot calling has been really good, but Gory's not going to be able to carry every single game, and unfortunately, that was kind of shown off here. I thought River got out jungled on the Sejuani. It's going to happen in the early game against the Lee Sin. You just got to hope that the rest of your team can kind of stem the bleeding overall, and, River could have done a little bit of a better job tracking closer, definitely throughout the mid game, but at the very least, like, it's not entirely his fault. And then Stixay I actually thought was pretty solid. The positioning on the Zeri was good. I thought he survived laning phase at a relatively good clip, which is pretty good in the isolated 2v2, but it certainly wasn't going to be enough to be able to take down this Lee Sin Azir combo just with the Zeri alone. I think overall, Golden Guardians is a solid team. They are a playoff caliber team. Do I think that they are guaranteed to be a top 4 team by the end of spring? I don't think they're guaranteed that spot. I certainly think they could be in that spot, but this is the kind of game that makes me question, like, is this really a top 4 team, or were they just overperforming in the middle of the split when teams like Evil Geniuses and Team Liquid and 100 Thieves and even CLG during certain weeks were all really struggling? I don't know. It's going to be really influential to see not only the rest of the regular season, but when we finally jump into best of 5s, how this team actually fares. If I had to lean in a direction right now, I would say probably not, but again, there is a lot of time for them to fix some of the problems that are currently ailing them, and hopefully they're going to be able to learn and grow from this loss. And then for 100 Thieves on the other side, this is exactly what I wanted to see. I just need you to keep up this momentum. If you play this game, the rest of the season, you're going to be a very scary team to deal with. It's never been the mechanics that have been the problem for 100 Thieves in 2023. It's been the early game, and it's been the decision-making. Hopefully, that has kind of been figured out now. Maybe a new coach coming in has reignited a lot with the team. Losing streak can definitely make players feel motivated, so I'm just hoping that this version of 100 Thieves is the real one rather than the one we've been getting most of the season. And then moving on to our 5th and final game of the first day here of Week 7 in the LCS. And we had another upset. Not only did we start the day, we're going to end the day with one of those. We had Counter Logic Gaming taking on Dignitas, and Dignitas picking up their 2nd win of the year with a big win over CLG in this one. And I just have to feel so happy for this Dignitas team. The momentum and the motivation and the confidence that they've been playing with over the past couple of weeks, ever since Tomo came into the AD carry spot, has been inspiring to watch. Even in some of the games that they lost, it really felt like they were right there. They were competitive with a lot of those teams, and they were actually pushing back on a lot of them. But here we finally see the fruits of that labor, with them being able to take down a notoriously inconsistent CLG team. We'll talk about them in a bit. This isn't particularly surprising knowing that it's CLG, but it is worth noting that they should not have lost this game. Let's talk about Dignitas, though, because they just played great. You could give player of the game to quite a few people, 3 in particular, and it's the 3 main laners here. Armut in the top lane, Jensen in the mid lane, and the one I personally gave it to, Tomo, in the bot lane. He's just been so good since joining this team. He was really good in the NACL, don't get me wrong, one of the more interesting players, but him and Diamond kind of traded off being really explosive players at that level, you know, kind of taking turns. They both were really solid. It felt like they made each other better. That synergy obviously helped out, and I was not expecting Tomo to be able to come up to the main roster and immediately be able to do that without his longtime support partner, but I was proven entirely wrong. He's been a huge breath of fresh air to this Dignitas team, if only just because he plays incredibly aggressive. Again, I already talked about this with another player earlier on this week, but sometimes swaps can benefit both players on the team. Talked about it with TSM, with Wild Turtle and Neo both playing better right now. That's been the case for Dignitas. I think Tomo coming to the main roster has looked awesome and has made this team more competitive, and Spawn going down to NACL, he's been incredible since he went back down. He's been one of the better AD carries in the playoffs, and so just another example of sometimes environment and, you know, mentality can really breed a lot of the success that you end up bringing. And Tomo was a great example of that. I know his scoreline doesn't look perfect, but him going in, flashing in on that Aphelios into the final team fight to get onto the Aurelion Sol won them the game. If they don't have Tomo for the last few team fights, they just lose the game, period, end of story. I know that it wasn't perfect before that. Aphelios is going to struggle in lane against something like Azaya, but if you don't have Tomo towards the back half of this game, they lose. If Spawn is in here, they lose. That's just the truth of the matter. And so, big credit to Tomo. Great game coming out from him. Jensen has to get a ton of credit as well. Not only was he really good in the mid game, but that flash ult onto the Aurelion Sol in the final team fight also just was so important. If you don't lock down that A-Sol on the enemy team in Palafox, who had a phenomenal game. We'll talk about that when we get to CLG, but Palafox was sensational in this one. If Jensen doesn't get onto him and use his ultimate onto the A-Sol to get him to blow up really quickly, that game is also in a much more difficult spot. Not only that, but Jensen is just a lot of fun to watch. Playing a champion like Cass, where it really is a lot about the positioning and the DPS that you're going to be able to do in a lot of these fights. So big credit to him. He was great. And Armut, a really good game coming out from him on the Croc in the top lane. Don't see a lot of really standout Renekton games in the LCS in particular. We definitely see them across, I would say, most of the other regions, but Renekton's one of those champions that I think just doesn't really work at the LCS level. Another champion that really typically does need gold in order to be as useful as he probably would need to be towards the back half of the team fights, but Armut got the gold this game. He was much better in the top lane, and he looked solid. This is honestly one of the better games that Dignitas has played all year long. It wasn't a blowout or anything like that. There certainly were mistakes, but for the most part, every player that needed to step up, stepped up, and I'm really proud of this team. As for CLG, on the other side, you gotta be frustrated. Not at Palafox. He was awesome this game, and I feel super bad that he lost it. He gets his A-Sol. He's basically been an A-Sol one-trick ever since this champion got reworked in Pro, and so maybe that's something that teams should take away from him. I don't know. He's looked really freaking good on it, and he's clearly proficient at playing the champion. He was a win condition for CLG. If Dignitas didn't do everything in their power to shut him down in that final team fight, CLG had a real chance of being able to win this game, but alas, the rest of the team was just a little bit too heavy to carry. I don't think they made any major mistakes. Like, there wasn't any, like, standout, oh god, why did you make that kind of play moments coming out from CLG, but just generally speaking, I do think that they were kind of underwhelming across the board. Luger was just not nearly as effective towards the back half of the game as Tomo was. Poom was going in on the recon and getting CC'd and blown up basically instantaneously. And then Dokla just kind of lost that top lane matchup. That's why he's going to get my dud of the series. It felt like he was the most obviously behind out of everybody, and the Gragas just really wasn't effective at all in the back half of the game. I think Dokla's a really good player. Not sure Gragas is one of his signature picks. He's going to like these more aggressive champions rather than ones that I think are going to be a little bit more team-oriented, but I think generally speaking, this is a blip on the radar for CLG. They are a solid team, and I don't want to forget that, but this is one of those teams that can lose to anybody on any given week. They have shown that many times over the course of many different seasons. That's just counter logic of them to do, and so I'm not going to look too hard into this loss, but big ups to Palafox. He really was fantastic here. And then for Dignitas, you earned this win. You absolutely were the better team in this game, and you earned it. Tomo has been awesome. Jensen has really stepped up now that he has another player to play off of, which I always thought was what this team was missing. Armut looked a lot better. I'm still waiting for Santorin to look a little bit more comfortable in that jungle position, but he wasn't a problem this game, which I think is an upgrade. Overall, Dignitas really showing some life that we didn't really expect to see towards the back half of the split, and really at this point, you're just kind of hoping that this team can take a lot of this confidence and translate it into potentially the summer split. Now that we're wrapping up day number 1, it's time to move into day number 2. And we kicked off day number 2 with a pretty interesting matchup between Team Liquid and Cloud9. You know, two organizations that have had their fair share of finals appearances over the past decade or so. But it's Cloud9 taking this one. Not too much of a surprise, but they just looked so good. This was a little bit of a beatdown on the side of Cloud9. And truthfully, now that this team feels locked in, their mid lane position feels incredibly strong, they might be the best team in the entire league. It really is that much of a difference to see what Cloud9 is right now and what they were at the beginning of the year. They were strong at the beginning of the year. They were playing around top lane in particular. Fudge looked like an MVP frontrunner for most of the year, but there were always lingering concerns about whether or not this team was going to be able to compete with the pure talent that a team like FlyQuest has. Even Evil Geniuses was probably outperforming them in terms of talent. Yes, Berserker and Fudge and Blabber are really good, but Diplex wasn't exactly offering this like monumental shift in the mid lane. His laning stats were awful, and it just wasn't like destroying the game like you would want him to. Well, introducing Eminus has just completely changed that entire narrative for Cloud9 as a team. He is unreal, mechanically speaking. His scoreline is okay, right? You're looking at a 3-1-8, and you're like, that's good, but, you know, why exactly is he player of the game? Go watch this. I don't think he got hit by a skill shot. I mean, Akali E, freaking Xayah Q, Lee Sin Q, Rakan W, the dude sidesteps everything. It's actually unreal how precise his mechanics are, how quickly his reaction speed is. The talent that Eminus has as a player is second to none in the league if he's able to completely capture it. I'm willing to say that. That is an insane statement to make with the players that are in this league, but it is legitimately unreal how well he plays when he is on in the mid lane. He was showing this off a bit in the NACL, but it's honestly become even more apparent when he's gotten to the LCS, when he's gotten more crazy stuff thrown at him, and he continues to just not have any sort of problem with it. He's got to get player of the game. I mean, the Syndra stuns in particular were massive. The ability for him to create picks for the rest of his team is completely influential in how C9 was able to play out this game. Yes, he wasn't the one capitalizing on every single pick that this team got, but without Eminus, like, this game is not nearly as easily. That's why he's going to get player of the game here. He was awesome on the Syndra. Obviously, Syndra Scatter can be an incredibly important ability, but when you're constantly catching Pioshik or Yon or Core out in the river, it's unstoppable to play against when your team is willing to play around you. Eminus and Blabber have unparalleled chemistry together. I can definitely see why Blabber wanted to play with him this season, not only because of mechanics, but clearly these two have practiced a lot on their communication between each other, because they are just completely in sync 24/7 on the Rift. It's one of the most impressive things that I've seen a Western duo be able to accomplish. You usually don't see Western duos really click together in that same way. That's usually like Korean and Chinese teams that have practiced endlessly in order to develop that chemistry, but Blabber and Eminus have that. Like, they have that, like, special kind of chemistry that we've really only seen out of, like, Yankos and Caps on the west side for the past few years, and so I'm really excited about what this Cloud9 team can offer. Fudge was awesome in the top lane. He was so much more useful than Summit this entire game. They saved counterpick for a top lane tank versus tank matchup, and then the Cho'Gath basically just existed to give Sion Heartsteel stacks. That's never good. Berserker was sick on this Zeri. He always is. It's its best champion. It's just so fun to watch this Cloud9 team because they are one of the few teams that I truly do think can gap you in every single lane by themselves, and that is ridiculously impressive. This team is very scary, and I certainly would not want to have to deal with them for the rest of the year. And then there's Team Liquid on the other side. Yes, Team Liquid is kind of on the up and up right now, but they ran into a very, very strong Cloud9 team that is really peaking at the right time, and they just couldn't handle that, which is understandable, but that certainly does not excuse this team from playing the way they did in the early game. You need that Lee Sin to step up, and you especially need Xayah and Rakan in particular to generate a lead here. You're going to have a lot of trouble dealing damage in teamfights. If this Xayah Rakan's not strong, your Cho'Gath should be fine on the top side. It's kind of a winning matchup, but even if it's not like it really matters. It's not like Sion's going to be able to kill him. And then the Akali is a losing matchup, I would say, into Syndra. That's a little bit of a difficult matchup for Akali to have any sort of, like, pressure in, but you've got Xayah Rakan. You can play out this game, and they just refuse to play through bot lane. Pyosik ends up getting out jungled super early on by Blabber. Like I said, it becomes pick city for Cloud9 in the mid game here with that Syndra scatter into Viego resets, even into, like, Annie stun. It's just very difficult for TL to find a part of the map where they're not just getting instantly collapsed upon because Cloud9's macro is just so good in this one, but for Team Liquid, there's just a lot that they still need to work on. My dud of the game is going to go to Summit in the top lane. You might be wondering, why am I giving this to a top laner who, essentially was just a tank and ended up dying in the late game? They save counterpick for the Cho'Gath into Sion matchup. Okay, sure, don't really get that. They invest into him, like they really try to get him strong, doesn't work out. And then this Cho'Gath in the late game is getting insta-deleted by Zeri anyways. I think he was the most obvious player to just be a complete non-factor on the side of Team Liquid. Yes, Pyosik had a bad early game. Yes, Harry on the Akali couldn't really accomplish anything. Yes, Yan and Core had a pretty bad game overall, but Summit was the one that really stood out to me to be like, what are you doing, man? Like, what exactly is the plan here? And I think Summit, this team really does live or die by him kind of surviving. I think Pyosik is definitely the one that is going to drive them to a lot of their wins, but Summit having a bad game could really erase a lot of the good that TL could do. And, luckily or unfortunately, depending on how you're looking at it, that wasn't the case in this series. Everybody played bad on the side of TL. And it's just one of those go next. You played a really good team who's in really good form right now. You probably weren't good enough to beat them, and so you lost. It ends up happening, but it is what it is. Cloud9 on the other side, I mean, it's going to take a lot in my power to, consider who to put at number 1 at the end of this video in the power rankings. But Cloud9 have made a fantastic case to be that team. Eminus is playing at an all-world level right now. He's been so good since coming into Cloud9. Blabber is one of the best junglers in the league. Fudge is an MVP candidate. Berserker might be the best AD carry in the league. Sven is a more than capable support, especially in this meta. I don't really know what the weakness of this team is. I don't even know if it has one, and so I'm pretty in on Cloud9. I feel really, really good about this team, and honestly, I expect bigger and better things for this team to come throughout the rest of the year. And then moving on to our second game of day number 2 here, and this one was way closer than it really had any right to be. We had Immortals taking on FlyQuest. FlyQuest does pick up the win, which they absolutely needed to here, but it has certainly not been a conclusive last few weeks for this FlyQuest team. They lose to Team Liquid on day 1, and they barely squeak by Immortals here on day number 2. This was an incredibly close game that absolutely had the potential to go the other way. If not for a pretty catastrophic mistake towards the back half of the game, FlyQuest would have been in some serious danger here. Luckily, Tactical's gonna tactical. He's gonna tactically amp. Every once in a while, he's gonna walk directly into a Scion Q and just die with all the gold on Xayah, and the game is over at that point. But there are good things to say about FlyQuest. First of all, player of the game for me is going to go to Vikla in the mid lane. He's almost been a little bit of the forgotten man here on FlyQuest. I think we've really started talking a lot about Prince and Ayla and how obviously Prince was really good at the beginning of the year, but he's kind of tapered off a bit. I'm not going to say it, but he certainly has not been in MVP form over the last 2 weeks, and Ayla has not made the kind of entrance that you would want in that support position. Spica has been really good over the course of the year. Impact's been really good over the course of the year. It almost feels like we've kind of forgotten a bit about Vikla here in the mid lane, but he reintroduces himself in this game against Immortals. Balulu was really good on the other side. We'll continue to talk about that because I continue to think that he's the best player on that Immortals team, but Vikla's got to be shouted out here. I see a lot of people online, and, I talked about this a bit on my Twitter. You can go follow me on Twitter if you'd like. I tweet about League of Legends sometimes. But I tweeted this out, as this video is basically going live, that a lot of people online are complaining about the Ahri Everfrost build, and I get it, kind of. Like, I think a lot of the idea behind it is that Ahri, as a champion, is intended at the pro level to deal damage, and I think that's just partially where I disagree. I think the damage build on Ahri in this game is super good. Look at the enemy team. You've got a Galio, you've got a Cassante, you've got a Nautilus. Like, you're going to be able to get through. You don't really need to lock these guys down, right? Like, CC's not really going to be a huge problem with Vi, with Rakan, with Sion. Like, you're not really going to be worrying about that. If you can get on the Xayah and blow her up, if you can get on the Viego and blow him up, these fights are going to be a lot easier. So yeah, damage is super good here, and I do think that there are situations where damage is better. But to completely say that the Everfrost build is troll and is bad, I just heavily disagree with. There are going to be games where damage does not matter, where you're either not blowing anybody up in the first place, or even if you are blowing them up, it is so much more useful for you to be able to hit charm and then keep that person CC'd for 2 seconds for your AD carry to kind of pop off. That's why we see that build so frequently across LCK, LPL games. It's because, truthfully, when it works, it is better. It is the better build, and I think people don't really care. People are like, ooh, big number, big damage number, it must be better. It's not always what the champion is made to do, but Vikla building damage definitely worked out in this game. He was really, really fun to watch. It's always fun to see a good Ahri get to play the game, and I think we got that in this one. Already talked a bit about impact up in the top lane, but that Scion catch towards the back half of the game was basically the difference between winning and losing for FlyQuest. If that Scion Q does not hit, if he presses ult, or if he presses Gale Force, or if he presses, God forbid, Flash, or any of his other summoners, right, then maybe this game becomes a lot easier for Immortals to actually try and do, but FlyQuest basically wins the game right then and there from that catch, so big credit to Impact. I thought him and Vikla are probably the two most consistent performers on the team, but you're going to see a lot of hate towards Ayla. I do think that he wasn't perfect in this game. He definitely missed some W's that, you know, maybe you shouldn't miss at an LCS level, but also the microscope under him right now is way too large. He's playing about just as well as any of the other supports that get a lot of praise in the LCS right now. I think Prince has taken a pretty big step back, though. His early games are just not as good. I think pulling out something like the Kai'Sa into Xayah, it's obviously not going to be nearly as easy, but Tactical was just straight better for most of this game as a player, even with Ayla not necessarily offering the same kind of support, maybe that someone like Fleshy was on the other side. I still think Prince probably should have been a little bit better in this game, and his positioning, his mechanics, it just doesn't feel nearly as crisp, as clean as it did earlier on in the season. Hopefully it's just a mid-season bump rather than something to worry about over the course, but right now I'm just a little bit concerned about that. I think the bot lane definitely still has room to improve. Ayla's mechanics are out of this world when he's playing in the right mindset. It just feels like he's a little bit mentally drained right now, and with everything going on, I kind of understand it. Hopefully the microscope can move a bit away from him. I think if he can get his footing down on FlyQuest a little bit first, then perhaps I think he could eventually grow into that thing that we all want him to be. But we all know what pressure does, especially to a lot of young kids here in League, and I doubt the Reddit mob is going to be getting off of his back anytime soon, so it's really put up or shut up for him from this point onwards. As for Immortals on the other side, though, they're really putting up fights. Yes, they're not winning games, but they're looking really competitive in a lot of those games, and that's just super fun to watch. It's really hard to criticize a team like Immortals, who clearly is just lacking in talent compared to their contemporaries, but they're keeping pace. Balulu is great. Tactical had a really good early game in this one on the Xayah, and Revenge is pretty solid on the Cassante. Unfortunately, again, Tactical's going to strike when Tactical's going to strike, and he gets caught out in that final fight. They end up losing the game because of it. A lot of people are going to want me to give Dud of the game to Tactical for that, but he beat Prince in the early game. It's kind of hard for me to give Dud of the game to someone who beat the best AD carry and perhaps the best player in the region in the early game. So for me, it's going to go to Kenvi in the jungle. It felt like he was the most irrelevant this game. His stuns and his communication with the team are just not there. Like, he's a really talented player, and I think he does find avenues for trying to make plays that other junglers just maybe wouldn't even look for, but it doesn't feel like Immortals is ready to follow up on almost any of the plays that he attempts to make. And then the plays that they are ready to follow up on, he doesn't really execute all that well. It just doesn't feel like he's on the same page as a lot of these other players. Balulu in particular does not feel like those two have the best of chemistry. That can be expected. They haven't really played together at all this year, but that's something that I think you're going to hope you can grow throughout the year because they're both talented. Of course, we know they've both smurfed NACL in the past, but, you know, it's just something that I don't think is necessarily working out right now. But overall, Immortals being a bottom-tier team is infinitely more interesting than, you know, they were at the beginning of the year, right? Bringing Balulu in, Tactical's playing a lot better. I think Revenge is a solid top laner. There's talent on this team that can go toe-to-toe with even some of the good teams in the region. It's just not going to be expected for them to be able to pick up some wins. But either way, this was a really good showing from an Immortals team that I'm pleasantly surprised about right now. And then FlyQuest on the other side, I'm not hitting the panic button yet. At the very least, you won this game, but there is a lot to work on when it comes to this FlyQuest team right now. They have not proven to me that they are the best team in the league like they were over the first couple of weeks. And with Cloud9 gaining momentum rapidly, this is a much closer race for first place than I think this team would like it to be. Moving on to our third game of day number 2 here, and it's another pretty intriguing matchup, this time between Counter, Logic Gaming, and Evil Geniuses. And EG picks up the win here. One of these teams was going to go 0-2 this week, and EG are very lucky for it not to be them. Now, this game was really solid from them. It really wasn't ever in doubt. They definitely had control, I would say, of a majority of the action here. However, I'm really not entirely sure if I can put that all on the good play of Evil Geniuses. There is a lot to talk about here. I'm not the draft guy. I like draft. I think draft is an important concept of the game, and I think that there is a lot that you can do with it in order to create creative advantages for yourself. But at the end of the day, you gotta play better. Like, if you play better, you'll probably win. That's really kind of how it is. If you are the better team, you can win with a worse draft. You just can. And if you're a worse team, you can lose with a good draft. That's just how it works. But CLG really put themselves in a hole with this one. I mean, this is a 1 damage comp. This is a 1 carry comp, and it's Kalista, who really needs to generate that gold in the early game to at all be relevant here. And then, you know, shout out to Luger, he goes Wits End into BT, 3rd or 4th item, and it's like, dude, how are you ever going to kill Sion? Like, in a million years, what is he ever going to do to Sion? And we saw that towards the back half of the game. We saw a lot of those fights around Dragon where it's like, he must have gotten like 15 or something autos off onto that Sion in the final fight. And he did like a maximum of like 500, 600 damage, like something ludicrous. He was probably doing like 30, 40 per auto to this Sion in the late game. And it's like, this is your carry? Like, this is your damage threat? The game was over in draft, and I hate to say that, but we'll talk about that when we get to CLG. Evil Geniuses played it well. Obviously, first thing to note, Jojo Pune not playing in this game, nor should he if he's really sick. Keep him off the stage. He deserves to be rested. He's, especially the playoffs coming up, super week coming up. You want him rested, you want him good, and so if he's got to take 1 game off, let him take it off, because you've got a more than capable mid laner in your Challengers team, and that's Ryoma. Ryoma's actually been pretty good for EG Challengers. I know that team has struggled quite a bit over the course of the season so far, and obviously is now out of the playoffs, but Ryoma certainly was not the problem with the team. It's good to see Tommy back on the LCS stage. He's someone who I've liked at the NACL level for quite a long time. He's never really been given a fair shake at the LCS level. It's good to see him step in, get to play a game of Azir, and honestly just get to look really good on it. He was probably the most impactful carry of this game. I don't know what I'm saying. FBI was really, really good on the Varus, but my player of the game for Evil Geniuses has to go to Inspired in the jungle. I know I've been a little bit lower on the impact that Inspired has had on Evil Geniuses over the course of this year so far, but this game was undeniable. That Poppy was fantastic. Incredibly important to play that into something like the Vi. It's a very hard counter. We saw it a lot in 2022. It's very difficult to actually play that Vi matchup. We'll talk about contracts in a second, but the Poppy creating that just indomitable fortress to run into in the early game really allowed the rest of the team to play pretty aggro. FBI and Vulcan did a great job generating their own lead in the bot lane on the Varus Ashe. I think that lane is incredibly strong. Ashe is banned out in most games for a reason right now, and it's because of this. But it wasn't just him. I think Someday was really good in the top lane. I honestly think he's going to get a little bit underrated for his performance. He was maybe the most crucial to the team in the late game here, but, you know, not using the Sion passive is always a little bit funny, so good to see a deathless Sion game. But FBI, Vulcan, Ryoma, Inspired Someday, everybody on Evil Geniuses kind of held up their own end of the bargain in this game, and it was kind of impressive to see. As for CLG on the other side, just not a super good performance from a team that, you know, obviously has had their ups and downs over the course of the season so far. Contracts is going to be getting my dud of the game. Not a good Vi game. You counterpick yourself. You pick the Vi into the Poppy. I don't get this even a little bit. This matchup, to me, feels unplayable. I've played this matchup in solo queue. It feels unplayable, and so I don't really know what the thought process behind this was, but Contracts ends up playing Vi. He really needs to generate that early lead, especially for that Kalista, because if you do not get Kalista online, it's going to be very difficult to play in the late game, as they found out. But they didn't get Kalista online. Contracts ends up giving over a lot of gold. That Vi becomes generally useless because that's what happens to that champion when she gets behind. Dokla's not really doing all that much on the Cassante because his damage is severely neutered because he's going into a Scion. You've got Poom engaging and no follow-up damage. Palafox can't set up any plays because he's not on Aurelion Soul. It just feels like a disaster for CLG. I hate to say this team is getting figured out, but it does feel like this team is getting exploited a bit over the back half of the season. Now, this wouldn't be the first time that we've said CLG's not playing well, and then the next week they come out and 3-0 or something like that. But it is worth noting that this is not a very good look for a CLG team that is kind of hanging on for dear life with their playoff struggles. They are actually technically still able to miss the playoffs if Team Liquid wins out and if they lose out, which is just not good, right? It's certainly not, and that's not to mention TSM. TSM can absolutely take their spot as well. That's assuming 100 Thieves isn't already in, right? And so there are a lot of teams that are pushing for CLG's final playoff spot right now, and them playing like this is certainly not going to help their case. Luger was bad. His itemization was bad. Contracts played bad. I thought Dokla played bad. Poom wasn't really all that good. Palafox just couldn't accomplish anything in the mid lane. This is not the performance that you wanted to see. There really is no other way for me to say that. And if CLG really wants to make playoffs in spring, which they absolutely should, they're really going to need to turn this around fast. As for Evil Geniuses, pretty good for a fill-in game with Ryoma. It's good to see him play well at the LCS stage. Obviously, he's not the long-term answer here. JoJo will be back in when he can be, as he should be, but it's good to see Inspired step up. Some days been good. FBI and Vulcan, I think, have been really underratedly great as a bot lane. In my opinion, one of the best in the entire region, and I don't think they've necessarily gotten the credit for that, but they've been really good. I think EG's a solid team. I'm still a little bit concerned about their ability to take down some of the top teams in the region, especially in something like a best of 5, but with FlyQuest struggling right now, there might be a hole open, especially if they continue their downward trajectory, and Evil Geniuses is definitely talented enough to be able to try and fill that hole. And then moving on to our fourth game of day number 2 here, and it's another one that I really was interested to talk about because of what happened on day number 1. Both of these teams looking for a 2-0 week. We had Dignitas taking on 100 Thieves, and predictably it is 100 Thieves walking out with a really important win for them here. Now, this team was looking kind of shaky. Obviously, I'd never given up too much hope. I had kept them within my top 6 in my power rankings, but they were definitely on thin ice going into this week. They had not looked good for quite a while. It felt like a lot of the strategies, a lot of the decisions that this team was going for had really not been working out, but I'm honestly incredibly happy to see this team get its shit together in this week. Obviously, the party's not over yet, but walking out of this week at 7-8 is absolutely massive for their chances of making playoffs. I think they just basically need to get to 500 with how their series have shaked out. They're honestly pretty okay in terms of tiebreaker situations. If they just win a couple more of their games, I think they're going to be in a pretty good spot. And with the form that they're on and the way that they played in this one, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. This was a little bit of a slaughter. We were talking about how Dignitas was looking a little bit better earlier on in the week. Well, unfortunately, that did not apply to this game here where it just was a little bit of a blowout. Let's talk about 100 Thieves first. My player of the series, it's actually up for debate. I think there are 2 people that absolutely deserve it in this series. Unfortunately, I can only give it to one. I'm going to go ahead and give it to Busio in the support position. Really like Busio as a player. I was a little bit lower on him than I was someone like Ayla coming up from the NACL, at least in terms of immediate impact. I felt like Ayla was probably going to dominate at least a little bit quicker. Busio maybe taking a little bit more time to get used to the LCS. That's proven to be correct and incorrect because both of them need time to get used to the LCS, but Busio feels like he's coming around. He gets to play as Rakan here. Again, this is a champion that I think he plays at an incredibly high level, and it's good to see this team kind of play into that. Closer gets to play a little bit more of a takeover jungler, someone that can create their own impact on the game, not someone that really relies on setting up the other members of the team, and I think that's really going to help this team because Closer and Busio were the 2 players that definitely stood out. Busio, again, player of the game, but you got to give a lot of credit to Closer as well. Some people are going to say that the early part of the season is too much for Closer to overcome. If he gets back in form just in time for playoffs, I mean, that is exactly what 100 Thieves is looking for. This could be a very dangerous team. We know Closer is one of the players that really does step up in the clutch, step up in the playoffs. He's definitely someone who thrives under the bright lights, and so for him to be getting right into form right now as we jump into some of the final weeks of the season, that's a really good sign for 100 Thieves overall. Hopefully Doublelift and Busio can continue to grow as a bot lane. It feels like they've been on a much better page over the course of this week. Again, 2 games of Xayah Rakan, so it's really not, difficult to see why they've been able to succeed. These are both champions that I think these players in particular have a lot of affinity towards, but it's just good to see them be able to execute on it. Again, tenacity on something like the Gragas in the top lane that can be relatively safe, but can also deal damage. Like, it's not entirely passive. And then Bjergsen on his Taliyah. I know people forget that Taliyah is one of his signature picks, but Taliyah is absolutely one of Bjergsen's signature picks. Taliyah, I put Swain last year in there, obviously Zilean. There have been a lot of picks over the years that I would say Bjergsen's kind of associated with, but people forget that this was absolutely a pocket pick for him, especially circa like 2016, 2017 when that champion first came out. And so it's good to see him continue to perform at a high level. I think 100 Thieves is getting a lot more comfortable with what their comfort actually is instead of trying to push the envelope, and it's definitely resulting in a lot more wins for the team. As for Dignitas on the other side, not a particularly shocking loss. You were pretty excited to be able to pick up 1 win already this week. 2 would have been absolutely miraculous considering you've only got 2 on the entire year so far, but unfortunately maybe getting blown out, like utterly destroyed, wasn't in the cards for this team. They just did not play very well in this game. My dud of the game Could go to quite a few people, if I'm being entirely honest, but it felt pretty obvious to give this one to Santorin in the jungle. I've been very low on Santorin in 2023. I've been very vocal about how low I am on Santorin in 2023, and that certainly is not going to change with how he performed in this game. Just got completely out-jungled by Closer, which I know, LCS historians are going to tell me is a bit of a pattern. Closer has historically performed incredibly well into Santorin as a jungler, but Santorin, I just need to see him step up. It's a meta that really should enable him quite a bit. He can play some of these more supportive jungle champions, things like the Sejuani that he pulled out in this game. He's just not playing them at a very high level. These are champions that he's known to be good at, that he's been able to show in the past that he can perform on in clutch situations. And something about this communication on Dignitas has just not worked for Santorin in 2023. He's been the worst player on the team now that Spawn is out, and I think that was very clear in this game. Jensen had a rare bad game. He hasn't had a lot of these ever since Tomo came up, and this team looked a lot more confident. It's going to happen every once in a while. Jensen's not this inflappable player. He's solid. He's a good mid laner, but as I've been talking about all year, he's not the kind of player that can dominate when he's the only good player on a team. He's going to have bad games every once in a while, and this was one of them. And then Ignar, Tomo weren't exactly really all that good either. Armut lost the top lane battle. Dignitas, in general, just kind of lost around the horn, will you say. But for Dig, I still think that they're in an okay spot. Like, you're not going to be winning this split anyway, so, the record doesn't matter. You just want to see growth from the team and from some of the players so you know what kind of direction you might want to move in when you get into summer. That might mean retaining every player if you feel like chemistry's building. It might mean making a few changes here or there, trying to find the players that you want to keep, players you don't. So it's really not about, performance at this point. It's really just about projecting that into the future. I don't really know what the answer to that is, but this was not a great sign for some of the players here on Dig. And then for 100 Thieves, they are very concerned with how some of these results go. They need to pick up wins, and this was a big one. Obviously, their schedule is not particularly hard down the stretch. This is a team that very realistically should be able to make playoffs, especially with the form that they're in right now, and that's just a really good sign for a team that I think was really, really struggling, especially over the middle of the season. Kind of the opposite of Golden Guardians in that sense. So to see them step up and start to play at a really high level, I think all the LCS fans are going to be pretty excited about that. And then moving on to our final game of the week here, game number 10 on the second day. We had a really interesting matchup. Two teams that are much closer in the standings than maybe they should have been a couple of weeks ago. We had TSM taking on Golden Guardians. And Golden Guardians does pick up the win. This is massive for them. They were really starting to worry me a bit with how they had been playing in the recent games, losing games to teams like Team Liquid. Obviously, teams like 100 Thieves earlier in the week. These are teams that they should be beating if they really are in the spot that we think they are. But they go up against another team that's kind of in that zone right now in TSM, really fighting for their playoff lives, and they are able to get the job done, which obviously is incredibly important to do, but it doesn't exactly erase all of the doubts and worries that I had surrounding this team. It is good to see, though, and it's good to see a lot of these players get their confidence back. In particular, this bot lane, which really was an absolute superstar for Golden Guardians in this game. My player of the game is going to go to Huhi in that support role. I know some people are going to give this to Stixay, and trust me, I'll get to Stixay. He was really good in this game, but Huhi's just on a different level in terms of when he is on. Those silences were massive for the Soraka. Obviously, you look at the enemy team, you're looking at a Vigar, you're looking at a Viego, perhaps even a Xayah, a Rakan. Like, if they get hit by a silence, a lot of their power ends up going down the drain. It becomes a lot more difficult for them to actually do a lot of the things that they want to do, and that becomes a problem in team fights, and Suhi was great on that. He was great in lane. He really made Chime's job a lot more difficult on that Rakan, especially trying to establish dominance early, and then obviously Stixay did a great job following up on that, but even just the generic power of the Soraka, the healing, the survivability that he offers in this game, it's really invaluable, and it would be a lot different if this team didn't have Huhi in this game, if they just had an average support. And so, player of the game for me was pretty obviously going to go to the Golden Guardian support in this one, but you do have to give a lot of credit to Stixay in the bot lane as well. His Ezreal has always been unbelievable. Obviously, there's the famous 1v5 clip of him in CLG's scrims, I believe, and it's always fun to watch. It's always a good time to go back and revisit young Stixay kind of getting his shot for the first time, but those mechanics have definitely not gone away. This is his best champion by a large margin. Obviously, the Caitlyn's up there as well, especially when you're looking historically for Stixay. Tristana, obviously pretty famous for him as well, but The Ezreal is really what he styled people on for most of the, the games that he has really dominated. And it's just one of those picks where I think you hit a point where you almost have to ban it out against Golden Guardians at this point because it really is that strong. The Caitlyn's definitely on that list as well, but really, really like Stixxay and Huhi. I've been a little bit critical of Stixxay over the last week or so. I think this game did help get rid of some doubts. Obviously, he is someone who plays pretty aggressive in lane, but sometimes that can come back to bite him, especially if his support is not on the same page. Luckily, these two are playing at a really high level right now, especially as a duo, and I really don't see any reason for that not to continue moving into playoffs. The other player that was really good on the side of Golden Guardians was River in the jungle. This was a pretty big jungle gap. Elise into Viego needs to go the way of Elise early, and trust me, it absolutely did in this game. Super active in the jungle coming out from River, which is what you want to see. You want to see him on the map, you want to see him making plays, you want to see him controlling the tempo. He was able to establish a gold lead so early on for pretty much all of his lanes that he really didn't have to do all that much in the mid to late game. Yes, he was caught out a bit in the late game team fights, but as Elise, you're going to get blown up. You're incredibly squishy towards the back half of the game. It's all really about making sure that your Ezreal and your Jace and your Sion can get online and get to that point in the game where they become team fighting monsters, and luckily for the Elise, she did absolutely that. So River, Stixxay, Huhi, definitely the standouts in my opinion for this game, but Gory obviously looking great. Licorice having a really solid game on the top side, one of his more solid ones in recent memory. Golden Guardians just having a nice bounce back game that, quite frankly, they desperately needed to establish some level of confidence back in me after what has been kind of a tumultuous last 2 weeks. So, and then for TSM on the other side, just not really what you wanted to see for a team fighting for its playoff lives. Obviously, they've kind of been overperforming over the course of the season so far, but at least Wild Turtle played well in this game. I thought some of the Xayah plays were solid. His laning was okay. He wasn't able to generate a huge lead in the laning phase, but his team fighting was really good. He just didn't really have a lot of backup around him. I would say it really was Wild Turtle and 4 bots on this TSM team. Maple had a particularly bad game on the Vigar. This feels like a very hit or miss pick in pro right now. Solo definitely accomplished nothing on the top side. Ended up just dying on the Cho'Gath a lot in this quote-unquote counter pick matchup. And then my dud of the series, or my dud of the game, sorry, is going to go to Boogie in the jungle. Just a big jungle gap. He was so far behind at 10 minutes that the game was basically over from that point onwards. There really just isn't a lot that Viego can do if he ends up getting completely out-jungled in the early game. Yes, he scales really well, but it's not particularly easy to play into a super fed Ezreal, Jace, Sion as a Viego. Like, I don't really know where you're going to be getting a lot of your resets. So definitely not a great performance from Boogie, a player who I think has shown flashes of being pretty good at this level, but the consistency definitely has been an issue for him over the course of the season. I'm not saying that he's a bad player, but I'm certainly not saying that he's a superstar either. I would say TSM definitely still has a chance of making playoffs. You're sitting at 7-8. That's the same record as 100 Thieves, don't forget. And, right around where Team Liquid is, CLG is kind of in that zone as well. And so there's a lot of contention right in the middle of the standings right now that basically any team that has a good final week can capitalize on. It's really going to be up to TSM to prove that they are the ones that deserve to take one of those final spots. And then for Golden Guardians, 9-6 is a pretty good place to be sitting. Obviously, it could be a little bit better with how things have gone in recent weeks, but I mean, at the end of the day, this team is still overperforming my expectations of 8th place for them going into the season, and I think a lot of that is repeatable. Stixxay and Huhi look really good as a duo. Obviously, River and Gory are awesome. Licorice, I think, has been getting at least a little bit more consistent on the top side, even if I don't think he'll be a strength for the team. Overall, Golden Guardians is solid. I just have a few questions about their ability to be a top team in the league, but at the very least, they're playoff caliber, and I think that's a good sign for a Golden Guardians team that really didn't expect to be there at the beginning of the year. All right, that is going to do it for my LCS Week 7 overview and analysis of all 10 games. Up on your screen right now, you're going to see the updated LCS standings after 7 weeks of action. Any teams colored in dark green have confirmed themselves locked into the top 2. We know who the top 2 are. It's Cloud9, it's FlyQuest. It's all going to be about seeding as we move into the final week. The light green shows you locked for playoffs. That's just Evil Geniuses right now, and of course, red shows you the teams that officially have been eliminated from playoffs, that being Immortals and Dignitas at the bottom of the standings. But that leaves a pretty big cluster in the middle that are not only fighting for seeding, but also fighting for spots, technically, in general. So let's go ahead and go over my power ranking changes. Of course, that's going to be in the first column to the right. In the second column to the right, you're going to see how this has changed from last week to this week. Let's go over it. Big change at the top, Cloud9 jumping up to number 1 in my power rankings. I'm just worried about FlyQuest. They have a lot of problems right now. Mostly Prince not playing at an MVP level. If he gets back to that, I'll feel a lot better about calling this team the best team in the league again, but I just got to see it on the Rift, and Cloud9 right now, especially with how Eminus has come in and started playing, I just feel very confident about their skill level and about their ability to just skill check teams in the playoffs. And so they're going to jump up to 1, FlyQuest 2, but really, I mean, these are the top 2 teams in the region. You can put them in either order, and I feel like I'll be okay. Evil Geniuses and Golden Guardians stay at 3 and 4. Then we got to swap at 5 and 6. 100 Thieves jump back up to 5. CLG falls back down to 6. This was how it was before last week, and I think they kind of proved me right this week. 100 Thieves looking really good in their wins. CLG kind of having an off week. Obviously, there's this big cluster around the number 5 spot. Only 2 of those 4 teams are going to be able to make playoffs. 100 Thieves, CLG, TSM, TL. 2 of those teams are going to miss it. 2 of those teams are going to make it. It's going to be really interesting to see how that goes in the final weeks of the season. And no real changes to talk about at the bottom of the standings. But let's go ahead and talk about my player of the week and my dud of the week in week 7 here. My player of the week, no shock. I mean, this is such an obvious choice. It's going to go to Eminus on Cloud9. He was so ridiculously good for the team this week in both games that he played in 2 very different games. The Trinivir game and the Syndra game were both pretty crazy and kind of on different levels. And so he's looking really good. He has basically been everything that this team wanted and then some. Really impressive stuff from him. The other player that I considered, Closer in the jungle for 100 Thieves. He was pretty solid. He gets an honorable mention, but my player of the week in week 7 is going to go to Eminus. And then my dud of the week this week was a little bit easier. This one's going to go to Kenvi on Immortals. He just didn't have a very good week. His VO is not particularly impressive. It doesn't feel like he has great synergy with Balulu in the mid lane, which is unfortunate because Balulu is a very good player for this team. And so hopefully they can continue to build upon that, but wasn't a particularly good look. I would say the other player that I considered here was actually Dokla for CLG. I think Contracts is kind of in the mix as well, but basically topside for CLG was definitely in the conversation. But I ended up with Kenvi from Immortals as my dud of the week in week 7, and Eminus from Cloud9 as my player of the week in week 7. But that's going to do it. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comments section below. What do you guys think is too high? Who do you guys think is too low in my power ranking? Because I love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. It really lets me know that you guys are enjoying the content. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Not only do we cover the LCS, we cover all 4 of the major regions and the NACL every single week, and especially with playoffs coming up, there is a lot of fun content coming out on this channel. So hit subscribe so you don't miss any of that. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.